My son Michael's voice cut through the Tuesday afternoon silence like a blade through silk. "Mom, is your boyfriend there?" The question hit me so unexpectedly that I nearly dropped my reading glasses into my coffee cup. "Yes, he's upstairs showering." "Why?" I glanced toward the ceiling, where I could hear the familiar sound of running water from my master bathroom. David had been up there for 20 minutes, which seemed excessive, even for a man who took grooming seriously. "That's impossible, Mom." Michael's voice carried that professional hotel manager tone I'd learned to recognize over his 15 years in the business. I just watched him check into my hotel with another woman. My blood ran cold. The coffee cup trembled in my hand as I set it down on the side table next to my worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. 8 months of what I thought was a loving relationship suddenly felt like standing on quicksand. Then I heard footsteps behind me. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me back up and tell you how I got here. My name is Margaret Sullivan, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 63 years old, a retired high school English teacher from Boston, and until 10 minutes ago, I thought I'd found love again after losing my husband Robert 3 years earlier. David Patterson came into my life at a grief support group meeting. Handsome, charming, 58 years old with silver hair and kind blue eyes. He told stories about losing his wife to cancer, how he'd been a successful investment advisor before retiring early to care for her. He said all the right things, asked about my late husband with genuine interest, and never pushed for more than I was ready to give. We'd been dating for 8 months. He stayed over twice a week, always perfectly respectful, always bringing flowers or wine. He'd even met Michael briefly when my son visited for Easter dinner. Everything seemed natural, comfortable, real. But those footsteps behind me weren't David's. David wore size 11 dress shoes that made distinctive sounds on my hardwood floors. These footsteps were lighter, softer, more careful. "Michael," I whispered into the phone, "I need to call you back." I slowly turned around, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. Standing in my living room doorway was a young woman I'd never seen before. She was maybe 30, with long auburn hair and wide green eyes that looked as shocked as I felt. "Oh my God," she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "You're not supposed to be here." Well, that was rich. This stranger was standing in my living room, telling me I wasn't supposed to be in my own house. If I weren't so terrified, I might have laughed. "Excuse me?" I managed to say, gripping my phone tighter. "Who are you and what are you doing in my house?" The woman's face went pale. She glanced toward the stairs where the shower was still running, then back at me. David said, he told me this was his house, that he lived alone." The pieces started clicking together like a jigsaw puzzle from hell. "David told you this was his house?" She nodded miserably. "He gave me a key 3 weeks ago. Said I could use his place when he was traveling for business. I've been staying here while my apartment gets fumigated." She held up a silver key that looked exactly like the spare I'd given David last month. My mind reeled. David had been giving tours of my house to other women, claiming it was his property. The audacity was breathtaking. "What's your name?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Sophia Chen. I thought I was David's girlfriend." Her voice cracked on the last word. "Oh, honey, we both thought we were David's girlfriend." The shower upstairs suddenly stopped. Both Sophia and I froze, staring at each other like 2 deer caught in headlights. Heavy footsteps moved across the upstairs hallway, heading toward the stairs. "He doesn't know you know about me, does he?" Sophia whispered urgently. I shook my head. "And he doesn't know I know about you. What do we do?" For the first time in 8 months, I smiled with genuine feeling. Poor David was about to get the surprise of his life. "Ladies, what a pleasant surprise." David's voice floated down from the top of the stairs, smooth as aged whiskey and just as intoxicating. He appeared at the landing wearing nothing but a towel around his waist, his silver hair damp and perfectly styled, even fresh from the shower. The man had remarkable confidence. I'd give him that. He descended the stairs like he owned them, which, according to Sophia, he'd claimed he did. His blue eyes moved between us with practiced calm, as if finding 2 women in his living room was a perfectly normal Tuesday afternoon occurrence. "Maggie, darling, you're home early." He leaned down to kiss my cheek like nothing was wrong. The familiar scent of my expensive aftershave that he'd been using for months filled my nostrils. Even his cologne was borrowed. "And Sophia," he continued without missing a beat, "I thought you were staying at your sister's this week." I watched this performance with grudging admiration. The man was a professional. He'd clearly been juggling multiple women for who knows how long, and he did it with the skill of a circus performer. "Actually, David," I said, setting my coffee cup down with deliberate precision, "Sophia and I have been having the most interesting conversation." His smile flickered for just a moment. "Oh?" "Yes," Sophia chimed in, finding her voice. "About how you told me this was your house, and how you gave her a key to my front door," I added helpfully. David's towel chose that moment to slip slightly, and he grabbed it with both hands. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely rattled. "There's obviously been some confusion," he said, his voice losing some of its smoothness. "Sophia, why don't you head upstairs and let me explain?" "No." The word came out sharper than I'd intended. "Sophia stays right here. We're going to have this conversation together." David's jaw tightened. "Maggie, perhaps we should discuss this privately. Like you discussed giving away my spare key privately?" I asked. "Or like you discussed your investment advisor career privately? Because my son Michael just called me from his hotel, where he watched you check in with yet another woman." The color drained from David's face. He stood there clutching his towel, no longer the confident charmer who'd swept me off my feet at grief counseling. He looked like what he was, a caught fraud. "How many of us are there, David?" I asked quietly. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For a man who'd always had the perfect answer, the charming deflection, the smooth explanation, he seemed remarkably speechless. "I can explain," he finally managed. "Please do," I said, settling back into my favorite reading chair like I was preparing for a particularly entertaining show. "Sophia and I have all afternoon." Sophia remained standing near the doorway, looking like she was ready to bolt at any moment. I couldn't blame her. If I weren't so angry, I might have been running too. David glanced around my living room as if seeing it for the first time. His eyes lingered on the family photos on the mantelpiece, the built-in bookshelves filled with my collection of classic literature, the antique writing desk that had belonged to my grandmother. All the details that should have told him this was clearly a woman's home, a home with decades of memories and personal touches. "The truth is," he said slowly, "my financial situation is more complicated than I led you to believe." I almost laughed. That was his explanation. Financial complications. "So you decided to move into my house and tell other women it belongs to you?" I asked. "That's your solution to financial complications?" "It's not like that." He took a step closer, then seemed to think better of it when he saw my expression. "Maggie, what we have is real. These other women, they're just what?" Sophia interrupted, her voice sharp with hurt. "Just stupid enough to believe your lies?" David's carefully constructed persona was crumbling like a house of cards in a windstorm. The silver-haired gentleman who'd held my hand through grief counseling, who'd listened to my stories about Robert with such apparent compassion, was revealing himself to be nothing more than a skilled manipulator. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked. "The grief support groups, the widowed women, the borrowed homes and fake identities?" His silence was answer enough. I reached for my phone. "I think it's time to call the police." "Wait," David's voice cracked with desperation. "Please, just give me a chance to explain. There are things you don't understand about my situation." "Then start explaining," I said, my finger hovering over the emergency number. "And David?" "This better be good." David sank onto my grandmother's antique settee like a man who'd been carrying a tremendous weight for far too long. The towel slipped again, and this time he didn't bother to adjust it properly. All his smooth confidence had evaporated, leaving behind someone who looked older, more tired, and infinitely more human. "My name isn't David Patterson," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia made a small sound of disbelief. I just nodded, because somehow I'd already suspected as much. "It's Daniel Morrison, and I'm not a retired investment advisor." He ran his hands through his damp hair. "I'm a caregiver, or was, until 6 months ago." "A caregiver?" I asked. "My mother had Alzheimer's. Severe, late stage. I'd been taking care of her for 12 years, ever since my father died. I used up all my savings, sold my house, cashed in my retirement accounts. Everything went to her medical care. Despite my anger, I felt a flicker of sympathy. I'd watched friends go through similar situations with aging parents. It could destroy families financially and emotionally. When she died last year, Daniel continued, I had nothing left. No home, no savings, no job prospects at 58. The grief support groups weren't just for meeting women. I really was grieving, but I was also homeless. So you decided to start conning widows? Sophia's voice was ice cold. It wasn't supposed to be like that. He looked at both of us with genuine pain in his eyes. It started small. I met a woman named Eleanor at a support group in Cambridge. She had this big empty house, kept saying how lonely she was. When she invited me to stay for a few days, it felt like mutual benefit, companionship for her, a roof over my head for me. But it escalated, I said, beginning to see the pattern. Eleanor introduced me to her friend Janet, who was also lonely. Janet introduced me to her neighbor, Patricia. Each one had needs I could meet, and each one had resources I desperately needed. I never meant for it to become what it became. I studied his face, looking for signs of deception. But for the first time since I'd known him, Daniel, seemed to be telling the truth. How many women? I asked quietly. He closed his eyes. Currently? 7. 7 lonely widows who thought they'd found love again, who'd opened their homes and hearts to this man. 7 women like me, getting ready for what they hoped was their second chance at happiness. What about the hotel? Sophia asked. Who were you with there? Rebecca Martinez. She lives in Newton. Today was supposed to be our special getaway weekend. His laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. I've become quite the juggler. My phone rang, startling all 3 of us. Michael's name flashed on the screen. I should take this, I said, holding up my phone. Michael had a right to know what was happening, especially since his call had started this whole revelation. Mom? Michael's voice was tight with concern. Are you okay? You hung up so quickly. I'm fine, sweetheart. Better than fine, actually. Your call may have saved me from making a terrible mistake. I glanced at Daniel, who was listening to every word. The man I've been dating isn't who he claimed to be. Is he still there? Do you need me to come over? He's here, along with another woman he's been deceiving. We're having what you might call a group therapy session. Michael's protective instincts kicked in immediately. Mom, get out of there. Out. Come to the hotel right now. Actually, I think I'm safer with witnesses present. I looked at Sophia, who nodded grimly. Besides, I want to hear the rest of his story. There's more? Oh, honey, there's so much more. I put the call on speaker. Michael, meet Daniel Morrison, also known as David Patterson. Daniel, this is my son Michael, who manages the Marriott downtown. Daniel raised his hand in a weak wave, apparently finding nothing absurd about introducing himself to my son, while wearing only a towel in my living room. Sir? Michael's voice came through the speaker with professional authority. I'm going to need you to leave my mother's property immediately. Actually, I interrupted, I think Daniel should stay and finish explaining exactly how this operation of his works, because I have a feeling there's more to this story than grief and homelessness. Daniel's face went pale again. Maggie, I've told you everything. Have you? I stood up and walked to my writing desk, pulling out a manila folder I'd been keeping there for weeks. Because I've been doing a little research of my own. I'd started investigating after finding some inconsistencies in his stories about his supposed investment background. A retired English teacher has excellent research skills, and something about David's tales had never quite added up. 3 weeks ago, I hired a private investigator, I announced, enjoying the shocked expressions on both their faces. Turns out, David Patterson has quite an interesting financial history. Daniel dropped his head into his hands. Oh, God! According to my investigator, you've been accessing these women's bank accounts, small amounts, carefully hidden, but definitely theft. I opened the folder, revealing bank statements and transaction records. 7 women, Daniel. You've stolen nearly $40,000 over the past 8 months. Sophia gasped. You're a criminal, and you picked the wrong English teacher to mess with, I added with a smile that had nothing gentle about it. Daniel looked up at me with something that might have been respect mixed with terror. What do you want? Justice, I said simply. But first, I want to meet the other women. To meet the why? All of them. By Thursday evening, I'd orchestrated what could only be described as the most awkward dinner party in Boston history. My dining room table, which usually hosted book club meetings and holiday dinners, now seated 7 women who'd all believed they were Daniel Morrison's one true love. Eleanor Whitman, 71, sat to my right, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the circumstances. She'd been Daniel's first mark, the widow from Cambridge who'd started this whole chain of deception. Across from her sat Janet Rodriguez, 65, clutching a tissue and looking like she wanted to disappear into her chair. "I feel so stupid," Janet whispered for the 3rd time since arriving. "We all feel stupid," Patricia Chen said sharply. At 59, she was the youngest of us and clearly the angriest. But feeling stupid doesn't help. Action helps. Sophia sat next to Patricia, having bonded with her over their shared experience of thinking they'd had keys to David's house. The remaining 2 women, Rebecca Martinez and Linda Thompson, sat quietly, still processing the revelation that their romantic getaways and intimate dinners had been part of an elaborate con. "Ladies," I said, standing at the head of my table like I was addressing a particularly challenging AP English class, "we have a problem. Daniel Morrison has systematically stolen from all of us, lied to all of us, and made fools of all of us. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" "Call the police," Rebecca said immediately. "Press charges, send him to prison." "That's one option," I agreed. "But there's a complication." I placed copies of my private investigator's report in front of each woman. "Daniel Morrison doesn't legally exist. No social security number, no credit history, no official records going back more than 2 years. Eleanor looked up from the report with sharp eyes. "He's using a false identity. Which means," I continued, "that prosecuting him becomes much more complicated. We need to find out who he really is before we can get justice." "How do we do that?" Linda asked quietly. She'd barely spoken since arriving, clearly overwhelmed by the situation. I smiled, feeling that familiar teacher satisfaction when a student asked exactly the right question. "We set a trap." Patricia leaned forward with interest. "What kind of trap?" "Daniel thinks he's in control of this situation. He believes we're just emotional women who'll eventually forgive him or slink away in embarrassment. He doesn't know about my investigation, and he certainly doesn't know we've all compared notes. So we use his arrogance against him," Sophia said, beginning to understand. "Exactly." I pulled out my phone and showed them a text message I'd received that morning. "He's been sending each of us the same basic message, asking for private meetings to explain everything and make things right. He's planning to manipulate us one by one, probably to keep us quiet." "The bastard," Eleanor muttered, surprising everyone with her language. "I suggest we give him what he wants," I continued. "But instead of 7 separate meetings, he gets one big family reunion." Friday night at 8 p.m., Daniel Morrison walked into my living room, expecting to find a heartbroken woman ready to listen to his explanations. Instead, he found 7 women arranged like a tribunal, each armed with printouts of bank statements, transaction records, and copies of his identical love letters. His face went through several interesting color changes as he took in the scene, from confident smile to confusion to dawning horror in about 3 seconds. "Surprise, darling," I said sweetly from my reading chair. "We thought we'd save you the trouble of multiple apologies." "Ladies, I can explain," he began, then stopped when he saw the evidence folders in our hands. "Please do," Eleanor said dryly. "Start with explaining why you told Janet you were a retired engineer when you told me you were an investment advisor. And why you told me you were a former Navy officer," Patricia added. Daniel looked around the room like a cornered animal. I adapted my background to what I thought each of you would find appealing." "You mean you lied more efficiently," Rebecca corrected. "The lies are just the beginning," I said, opening my folder. "Sophia, would you like to read the bank statement showing the $800 Daniel withdrew from your account last month?" Sophia's voice was steady as she read the transaction details. "ATM withdrawal, October 15th, 11:47 p.m. While I was asleep next to you, believing we were building a relationship." Daniel's shoulders sagged. "I was desperate. I needed money for..." "For what?" Linda interrupted, speaking for the first time all evening. "For the $200 you stole from my checking account? For the credit card you opened using Eleanor's information? For the loan you took from Patricia that you never intended to repay?" The man looked genuinely broken now, all his charm and confidence completely drained away. I never meant for it to go this far. But it did go this far, I said firmly. And now we need to know who you really are. I pulled out the last document in my folder, the one that had arrived by email just 2 hours earlier. My investigator made an interesting discovery today. Daniel Morrison is an identity you stole from a man who died in Oregon 3 years ago. The room went completely silent. Your real name is Thomas Bradley Hutchinson, and you're wanted by the FBI for running con games in 12 states over the past decade. Daniel, Thomas, closed his eyes and seemed to age 10 years in that moment. We know about the seniors in Florida, I continued. The group home scam in Arizona. The elderly man in Nevada who lost his entire retirement to your investment scheme. How did you, he started. Find out? I smiled. Never underestimate a retired English teacher with internet access and a good private investigator. Thomas Bradley Hutchinson sat in silence for a full minute, staring at his hands folded in his lap. When he finally looked up, his face held a resignation I hadn't seen before. You want the truth? He asked quietly. The whole truth? It would be refreshing, Eleanor said tartly. I started running cons when I was 19. My mother wasn't sick with Alzheimer's. She threw me out when she caught me stealing from her purse to buy drugs. I've been living off other people's kindness and stupidity for 39 years. The casual cruelty of that statement, other people's stupidity, hit each of us like a slap. Some of the women I've scammed, he continued, they never recovered financially. There was a lady in Phoenix, Margaret Chen, 73 years old. I took her for $60,000, her entire life savings. She had to move in with her daughter after that, lost her independence completely. Sophia made a small sound of distress. Margaret Chen had the same last name as Patricia. That was my aunt, Patricia said, her voice deadly quiet. Aunt Margaret died last year. My family always wondered what happened to her money. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thomas's face went white as he realized what he'd just revealed. She was your aunt? He whispered. She was, Patricia said, standing slowly. And she spent the last year of her life ashamed and broken because some piece of garbage convinced her he loved her and then stole everything she had. I watched this exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about our money or our broken hearts anymore. This was about justice for all the women Thomas had destroyed over the decades. How many others? I asked. How many elderly women have you stolen from? I don't keep count, he said, then seemed to realize how that sounded. I try not to think about, give me a number, Patricia demanded, moving closer to where he sat. Maybe 200? Over the years? 200 elderly women. 200 life savings accounts drained. 200 women like Patricia's Aunt Margaret, left with nothing but shame and regret. Well, I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt, I think we've heard enough. I walked to my front window and pulled back the curtain. Thomas, I'd like you to meet Special Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. She's been listening to our conversation from the van parked across the street. Through the window, we could all see a black SUV with its doors opening and several people in suits getting out. Thomas shot to his feet. You set me up. We set you up, I corrected. All of us. Together. The look of absolute betrayal on Thomas's face was almost comical. After spending decades manipulating trusting women, he couldn't believe we'd turned the tables on him. You can't do this, he said, backing toward my kitchen as the sound of footsteps approached my front door. I trusted you. You trusted us? Rebecca laughed, but there was no humor in it. You stole our money and our dignity, and you think we owe you trust? The doorbell rang. I walked calmly to answer it, leaving Thomas standing in my living room surrounded by 7 very angry women. Mrs. Sullivan? The woman at my door was younger than I'd expected. Maybe 40, with short blonde hair and intelligent brown eyes. I'm Special Agent Walsh. Thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. Thank you for taking us seriously, I replied, stepping aside to let her and 3 other agents enter. He's in the living room, and he just confessed to running cons on approximately 200 elderly women over the past 39 years. We heard, Agent Walsh said grimly. Mrs. Sullivan, I have to tell you, when you first contacted our office 3 days ago, we weren't sure this operation would work. Criminals like Thomas Hutchinson are usually too smart to confess to multiple federal crimes in front of witnesses. You underestimated the power of 7 angry women working together, Eleanor said with satisfaction. Agent Walsh smiled. I'll remember that for future cases. Thomas tried one last manipulation as Agent Walsh approached him. Please, he said, turning to me with tears in his eyes. Maggie, what we had was real. I do care about you, about all of you. I studied his face for a moment, looking for any sign of genuine emotion beneath the practiced desperation. All I saw was a man who'd spent so many years lying that he'd forgotten how to feel anything authentic. Thomas, I said gently, if you really cared about us, you wouldn't have stolen from us. If you really cared about the 200 women you've victimized over the years, you would have stopped after the first one. Agent Walsh began reading him his rights as one of the other agents handcuffed him. Thomas's shoulders shook with what might have been sobs or might have been rage. Mrs. Sullivan, Agent Walsh said as they prepared to leave, your testimony and evidence will be crucial in prosecuting this case. Are you prepared for that? I looked around at the other women, seeing determination on every face. We'd started this evening as victims. We were ending it as witnesses for justice. Agent Walsh, I said, we'll be ready for whatever you need. As they led Thomas away, he looked back at me one last time. I really did care about you, Maggie. No, I said quietly. You really didn't. But that's okay. Because I care about myself, and that's something you never counted on. 6 months later, I sat in federal court watching Thomas Bradley Hutchinson receive a 25-year sentence for fraud, elder abuse, and identity theft. Patricia sat next to me, holding a photograph of her Aunt Margaret. Eleanor was on my other side, having flown in from Cambridge specifically for this day. The court recognizes, Judge Harrison said from the bench, that the defendant's crimes have caused immeasurable harm to dozens of elderly victims across multiple states. The systematic targeting of grieving widows represents a particularly cruel form of predatory behavior. Thomas, wearing an orange jumpsuit and looking older than his 58 years, stood motionless as the judge continued. However, this court also recognizes the extraordinary courage shown by the 7 women who orchestrated Mr. Hutchinson's capture and confession. Their actions have not only brought justice to themselves, but will prevent countless future victims. After the sentencing, Agent Walsh found us in the courthouse hallway. Ladies, I wanted you to know that your case has become a model for how law enforcement works with elderly fraud victims. We're implementing the Sullivan Protocol in field offices across the country. The Sullivan Protocol? I asked, trying not to smile. Community-based victim cooperation with law enforcement support. Let the criminals think they're still in control while building an airtight case against them. Eleanor chuckled. Sounds like something a group of retired teachers and nurses might come up with. Exactly. Agent Walsh shook our hands. Thank you again for your service to justice. As we walked out of the courthouse into the bright spring afternoon, Patricia turned to me. So what now, Maggie? Back to quiet retirement? I thought about it for a moment. The past 8 months had been the most challenging and ultimately rewarding of my life. I'd discovered strengths I didn't know I had, and formed friendships I never expected. Actually, I said, I've been thinking about starting a support group. Not for grief this time, but for elderly fraud victims. Help them understand they're not alone, and that being victimized doesn't make them weak or stupid. Count me in, Eleanor said immediately. And me, Patricia added. All of us, Rebecca said, speaking for the group. I looked at these remarkable women who turned their pain into power, their victimization into victory. Thomas Hutchinson had thought he was preying on lonely, vulnerable widows. Instead, he'd awakened a force he never saw coming. You know what the best part is? I said as we walked toward the street. He probably thought he'd broken us, thought we'd spend the rest of our lives feeling ashamed and foolish. Instead, Eleanor said with a grin, we're stronger than we've ever been. As I drove home to my house, where I lived alone by choice and not by circumstance, I thought about the lesson Thomas had inadvertently taught me. He'd shown me that I could survive betrayal, fight back against injustice, and trust my own instincts even when everything seemed wrong. At 63, I'd learned something new about myself. I was not a victim. I was a force to be reckoned with, and any man foolish enough to underestimate an angry English teacher did so at his own peril. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.